Welcome to the Quiet Casefiles, a place for calm, thoughtful mysteries told slowly and without urgency. Each story you hear here is a work of fiction, a whodunit meant for quiet listening. My name is Alistair Crowe, and tonight you are invited to sit with me at a small house by the sea and see if you can gather the clues and settle the questions before the final truth is spoken. If you enjoy this kind of slow, patient storytelling, please consider liking, subscribing, and following the channel so more quiet cases can find their way to you. And a gentle request, please keep the comments free of spoilers so others may discover the mystery for themselves. The lane down to the boarding house was a ribbon of worn gravel threaded with salt and a few stubborn tufts of grass. I remember the way the light hung just above the horizon that afternoon. Thin and patient, like a page held up to the sun. The house itself sat with its back to the wind, whitewashed and quietly tired, a row of bay windows looking out over sea that had the soft patience of someone who had carried 100 small secrets and never bothered to shout about them. Mrs. Hester Greaves opened the door herself. She is small in bone and large in habit, a woman whose hands have learned the exact weight of plates and the sound of a teapot when it is precisely half full. She showed me my room and moved through the house with the kind of economy that comes from knowing a pattern so well it becomes a language. She told me, simply and without embellishment, that this was the final weekend. The house would close its doors for good when the Sunday curtains came down. She had invited a handful of people to divide up the things that had accrued over decades: dishes, a brass lamp, a stack of letters in a tin. Many were past lodgers, some were neighbours, a few had reasons that might seem stranger still. Mrs. Port. Greaves preferred to call them friends of the house. People began to arrive in the late afternoon, like gulls returning to a favoured cliff, each with a small itinerary of habit tucked into their coat pockets. There were 6 of us, not counting Mrs. Greaves and the small staff who would tend the house for the weekend. Leonard Pike came with the slow, sure step of a man who had spent most of his life on decks, hands roughened by rope and weather. He kept his eyes on the horizon, as if it were a ledger he might one day need to cross-check. Cara Ames arrived with a satchel of clay under the flap of her coat and a smudge of earth always on the back of her hand. Rupert March walked in with precise shoes and the ledger in a leather cover. He had the look of someone who lived by ordered lists. Nora Bennett brought with her a shallow crate of tins, tea tins, all labelled in her careful hand, and it was not quite a surprise to learn she ran the tea shop on the seafront. Peter Hollis arrived with a small notebook and a slow curiosity. He said little, but his eyes took inventory where others took breath. And then there was Mr. Andrew Fenton. He had the polite, sharp manner of someone who kept his observations like tools in a case and used them when needed. He carried a thin bundle of envelopes and a small leather wallet. He smiled easily enough, but it was a smile that suggested he had learned to keep certain facts folded neatly into their own pockets. We sat in the parlour that evening beneath a single lamp that dusted everything in warm, low gold. The house smelled of boiled scones and waxed wood and the faint iron of the sea. There was an auction list tacked to a corkboard, written in Mrs. Greaves' careful script, a set of blue, patterned cups, a brass candlestick, a child's wooden horse with one ear chipped. Conversation unfolded the way it often does among people who are, mostly, strangers, polite, circling, sometimes finding a common ground and sometimes skirting it entirely. Someone remarked on the glow of the fireplace. Someone else on the gull's dogged habit of calling at dusk. It occurred to me in those first hours how often small routines bookend larger events. I ordered tea, as I often do when I am thinking. The kettle sang in the kitchen, and Nora moved with the ease of someone who knows exactly how much steam a tin can take before it gives up its scent. She set a pot of bergamot on the tray, a bright citrus-scented blend that seemed a little precious in a house that had held on to things because they were useful more than because they were pretty. As the evening went on, the reasons for each of us being present began to thread themselves through the conversation. Leonard had come to retrieve an old chest that had belonged to his brother. Rupert was there to help catalogue and to be paid in small installments from the sale, if an arrangement could be made. Peter was making a record for a local archive. There were attic papers he felt ought to be preserved. Clara had been asked to take a few of the teacups as a keepsake. They matched her hands, she said, for the way they sat. Nora had claimed first refusal on the tea service and the small willow tray that had belonged to Mrs. Greaves' sister, Mr. Rhine. Fenton, when asked what brought him, said only that there were matters to be settled before the house closed, a phrase that landed in the room like a pebble in still water. None of it felt theatrical. There were no raised voices, no pointed accusations. No one declared a drama, and everyone seemed to accept that some secrets were only ever revealed in careful increments. Yet beneath the calm there was a tautness, less like a drawn wire and more like a held breath. People come to old houses for many reasons. Some come to take, and some come to give back. Some come to settle accounts. One might wonder, in a place like that, a house that had held people through bad weather and fine mornings alike, what it is that really keeps a house alive when the last pair of visitors leaves the door closed. At the fire's edge the night softened into a late attentive quiet. Lamps were turned down. Voices grew small and went to the rooms they had been given. Before the house surrendered entirely to sleep, I walked the corridor and made a note of who went where and what they took with them into the dim. People leave traces in the most ordinary ways. A scuff of mud on the mat, a purse left on a chair, the faint curl of hair on a pillow. It is in those traces that an investigator of habit, if one is paying attention, often finds the first outlines of what might come next. That night, very small things settled on the sill. Salt caught in the grain of the wood, a smear of soap on the basin. None of it seemed important then. But the sea had a way of telling its stories slowly, and the house, which had kept its own steady record for decades, was about to collect a new entry. Morning opened with gulls and the slow warmth of a weak sun. The house had a particular hush in the early hours, the kind that comes from rooms remembering last night's conversations and lapsing into thought. I made my way downstairs because habit had a way of teaching me where the steam would be. The parlour was a study in domestic geometry, chairs arranged in careful conversation, newspapers folded at the corners, a row of teacups on a drying cloth. Mrs. Jorrol Greaves moved among the places with a calm that felt like an old clock finding its rhythm. The gathering proper began that afternoon. People drifted in from their rooms with reasons to be together. Rupert took to his ledger with an earnestness that looked almost like prayer. He had begun, in quiet voice, to list the items that would be sold at the end of the weekend and who had first refusal. There was a small ceremony to it, names placed beside objects as if the things themselves had been people deserving of their own careful last wishes. Peter moved from shelf to shelf, making small entries in his notebook, and sometimes pausing to run a thumb over the spine of a book, as though it might read back at him. Mr. Fenton was at ease among such arrangements. He liked the way an inventory could reveal character, and he remarked with the pleasant half-smile of a man who knows how to steer a conversation, that the house had choices to make about what would go where. He spoke casually about a packet of letters, as if letters could be arranged like postcards. That casualness surprised the others. Leonard, who had a slower temper, folded his hands and went abruptly still when Mr. Fenton mentioned correspondence. Something in that name landed as if it had weight, the sort that settles into a pocket and cannot be shaken free. Tea kept the centre of things. Nora's tins, sat on a small tray by the window. Bennett's bergamot, seafront breakfast, Greaves House blend in an old canister with its label worn nearly threadbare. It had been Nora who had suggested we use the bergamot that afternoon. It smelled, she said, like afternoons. And for reasons that now seemed ordinary, the scent became a part of the house's memory that day, a bright citrus edge that threaded through conversation and crossed into pockets of disagreement. People have belongings that say more about them than they would like. A tin of tea is among the least judgmental of such things, and yet the tin was both practical and private. Nora kept a small amount of concentrated bergamot in a tiny pot for customers who asked for a little more than usual. She had said that in the parlour with a light laugh, describing it as a shopkeeper's indulgence. It was in that afternoon's conversation that the first small friction began to show. Mr. Fenton, with a tact that can quickly become cruelty, suggested that there were matters among the guests that ought to be cleared up before the house closed. The phrasing was casual, but its implication was not. He said he had papers, notes, and some claims that would be inconvenient for a few people if they reached broader eyes. Rupert's jaw tightened. Leonard left the room for a moment and returned with the wind in his voice. Clara's hands went to the edge of the table as if to find purchase. No one accused him outright. There was no need. A suggestion can sharpen a room like a hard wind. That evening, a supper was said at the long table. The conversation moved like low tide. Sometimes it receded into safe shorelines, and sometimes it dragged a little further out where something might be glimpsed. Mr. Fenton's remarks had put small items into motion. A ledger closed a little too fast. A line in a sketchbook was crossed out. The tin of concentrated bergamot, having been mentioned, seemed oddly proximate now that people had reasons to be guarded. We each had our routines. Leonard took to walking the east path at dusk, the salt settling into the grooves of his walking stick. Rupert counted the coins he expected to receive for certain objects. Clara took to sketching the chipped teacups and humming when she thought no one was listening. Peter made notations about the attic papers and checked the hinges on the old trunk. These patterns are small architectures of habit. In a house like that, when something unexpected arrives, it is the shift in habit that more often betrays the event than any single dramatic movement. There were small irritations, a missing teaspoon, a chair moved from its place, a curt exchange about the order of sale, and we all noted these in the private ways we note such things. Over dinner, I watched those exchanges, like a cartographer might watch a coastline, little bays where conversation pooled, a narrow channel that carried unease from one end of the table to the other. The house, being used to quiet disagreements, took them in stride. Doors were closed gently, and a great deal of tea was drunk. After supper, some of us withdrew to the front parlour. The lamp was low and cast shadows that made the faces of the room look like paper cutouts. Mr. Court. Fenton spoke in a tone that was half kindly suggestion and half thin warning. He had the letters, he said, that proved a few unpleasantries, and he saw no reason for the house to remain closed to new knowledge. It doesn't have to get ugly, he said, and his voice had the careful, precise edge of someone pruning a tree. We can settle it quietly. The words would hang, later, with much more weight than any of us gave them that night. People drifted to their rooms in the late hours. The sea turned and turned itself under a sky that could not be hurried. I moved down the upstairs hall and listened for the particular rhythms each guest made in their room. The soft closing of a book, the sound of someone walking to the window, the kettle in another house that turns and steeps. The house took on the small, attentive stillness of a place waiting to see what would come of the conversations settled like stones in its rooms. Those were the patterns of the gathering: tea and ledger, tins and papers, a careful naming of objects, and beneath it all the low murmur of things that might yet be unspooled. The last weekend of the boarding house began with the ordinary arrangements of people who keep their private lives in neat envelopes. I noticed the way Mr. Fenton cradled his notes. I noticed how people who had been strangers until that day began to line up their memories and their possible objections like tools waiting on a shelf. One might suppose, in such a place, that nothing more than a quiet sorting would occur. One might wonder, as I did that night, what it is that makes a room like this brace itself when a single, confident voice steps in and starts to rearrange the furniture of people's pasts. The house has a way of waking slowly, but that morning it seemed to wake with a start. I was in the kitchen when I heard Mrs. Greaves call, that precise, small intonation she uses when she wants someone at her side and does not wish to be misunderstood. There are sounds that have a weight. I felt the fall of the house's mood like a window letting in a gust. It was the housekeeper, Mary, who said she had gone to check on a guest and found him unresponsive in his room. We moved through the corridor with shoes that made soft, uncertain sounds on the runner. The door to Mr. Andrew Fenton's room was not locked, which is the sort of ordinary detail you notice because everything else tends to be as arranged. He was seated by the bedside chair, tea still at his hand on a small tray. The room tidy enough to suggest that whatever had taken him did so without a struggle. I will not describe what one sees in such a moment in clinical terms. The fact of someone's breathing gone quiet is enough to change the atmosphere of a house, and that is what happened. The air seemed to shift as if the rooms themselves had adjusted. There was no visible wound. The cup on the tray was nearly empty. The envelope he had been carrying lay open on the bed, with a few letters spilled like pale leaves. The kettle had been used, the steam gone. There was the faint, bright note in the air of bergamot, the same scent that had threaded the house since Nora brought in her tins. We gathered, and the conversations that followed were small and careful. Mrs. Greaves rang the village constable, or said she would. She did this the way one arranges a dial and leaves the rest to procedure. For those hours the house contained two threads, the ordinary domestic thread of cups and the knot of a body that did not belong to ordinary conversation. I notice details because that is what I do. The tray beside Mr. Fenton's chair was a familiar, small willow piece belonging to Mrs. Mess's, Greaves' sister. There was the faint smudge of jam on its rim and a bit of tea stained at the lip where someone had set the cup down. The cup itself was one of the house set, chipped at the handle, and on the underside, almost invisible, a small maker's mark. The sugar bowl that usually travelled with that service was absent from the tray. The room had the quiet of someone recently occupied, the slippers by the bed, the coat on the chair, but also a small scrap of paper folded and tucked into a pocket on the bedside table with the single word "shop" written on it. People offered their accounts of who had been up late, who had been seen moving through the house, and when. There were the expected contradictions of recollection. Rupert said he had read until late and then gone to bed. Leonard thought he had seen Mr. Tacky. Fenton shut the parlour door as he passed by at a little after 11. Clara said she had heard the kettle and thought nothing of it. Peter recorded the times with the quiet patience of someone not yet ready to draw conclusions. Nora, who had been in the kitchen early that morning arranging tins for the front display, said she had not seen Andrew after supper. None of the accounts were conspiratorial. They were simply soft quarrels of memory. A few physical things pulled more insistently at my attention. On the windowsill there was a faint crust of salt and a small smear of mud, a pattern one sees when someone has walked the yard and returned without wiping their shoes. Outside, the path bore shoe marks leading both ways, and near the hedge there was a cigarette butt of a brand I had not seen in the evening, but that matched a packet in Rupert's room. Little things like that create a pattern, but patterns do not always point to a single conclusion. The absence of the sugar bowl proved oddly important in the way these small things are important, not because sugar bowls are valuable, but because something missing invites a question about where it went and why. Mrs. Greaves insisted gently that the sugar bowl had been on the sideboard that evening. Someone had used it, she said, and later it had been left behind. Where had it been left, and by whom? We sat in the parlour and watched the windows and the slow flow of the tides. People do strange, small things when something shocking occurs close at hand. I saw Rupert stroke the leather of his ledger with a hand that had gone suddenly ineffective. Leonard sat with the exactives of his hands clasped. Clara seemed poised, as if a sketch of the event might save her the trouble of living through it. Peter took his notebook and wrote with a solemnity that felt almost sacramental. Nora moved back and forth between the kitchen and the parlour with a face made careful by a shopkeeper's habit, calm, attentive, and practical. At some point, without ceremony, I asked to see Mr. Fenton's room again. Mrs. Point. Greaves allowed it in the quiet way of a woman who understands certain curiosities cannot be held back. The tray with the teacup still had a faint, bitter ring. I noticed, as I often do, how small elements betray larger events. A slight sugar crust at the rim of where the bowl had been sits like a folded note. The burnt corner of a letter tells one part of a story. A receipt for tea in a pocket reads like an invoice of an appointment. When the constable came later, the house moved into the business of being a place that had had an extraordinary thing happen in it. People were asked things and gave answers that were both true and incomplete. An inventory was made and someone wrapped the teacup and the tray. For me, the most telling thing was not a single dramatic fact, but the way the house rearranged itself around the absence. Tea was still brewed in the kitchen, the lamp was left low, and the curtains were not drawn back against the day. There are moments when a house holds its breath and things settle into their places again. That afternoon it seemed as though the house had tried to go on with its work and discovered one of its springs missing. People went about small tasks with the careful quiet of those inhabiting a site of private grief and public curiosity. Little questions began to mount. Who had been in the room with Mr. Fenton? When had he last been seen alive, and what had been in the letters he carried? The answers were not straightforward, and in those hours I bathed in details and let them sit in the margin of my thought like shells waiting to be opened. Questions are often the slowest part of a case. They arrive in manners that are small and domestic, and they are answered in the same way by people who do not always wish to make anything larger than it must be. After the house had done the necessary, the call made, the constable informed, the body tended with a certain respectful care, we returned to the more intimate business of recollection. I listened and took note of the times each person offered. Memory is not a ledger, it is a compendium of impressions. Rupert told us again that he had been in his room near midnight and read until the lamp went out. He could not say with certainty when the noise of the kettle had ceased. Peter gave me his notebook to browse, and it showed small methodical entries, attic papers catalogued, a note about the tin of bergamot having been removed from the parlour that afternoon, and a reminder to follow up on a receipt found in Mr. Fenton's jacket for a small purchase at Nora's shop. Clara's sketchbook held a page I noticed that afternoon, a line drawing of a teacup with a note scribbled. He promised to stop, and then struck through. It occurred to me, as I often find my head wandering toward the texture of evidence rather than any grand theory, that the pattern of habit is often where responsibility hides. Someone who visits a pantry wears a faint film of flour on their thumbs if they like to bake. Someone who tends a shop would have a certain fold to a receipt where it is tucked away for the day. Such small things accumulate and sometimes speak louder than a declaration. I began with the tea. There was, as I have said, the bright citrus lingering in the air that day, and it was not a scent one forgets easily. We all associated it with Nora because of her tins and the story she had told about keeping a tiny pot of concentrated bergamot for customers who asked for an extra note of brightness. "A little goes a long way," she'd said the night before with the kind of shopkeeper's frankness that doubles as a warning. The scrap of paper with the word "shop" in Mr. Fenton's room read like a small appointment note. Peter's record that he had found a receipt in a jacket pocket was the sort of detail that moves an accusation from the realm of feeling to the realm of traceable events. The missing sugar bowl bothered several of us. It is a small thing to point at, but the absence of the familiar is sometimes the sharpest clue. Mrs. Greaves insisted it had been on the sideboard after supper. No one could say with any certainty where it had been placed after that. I checked the cupboards myself with as gentle an air as I could assume and found, tucked at the back of the shelved pantry, a small tea strainer that did not belong to the sitting service. Closer inspection showed it bore a faint residue unlike the house's strong breakfast blend, something brighter, oilier, citrus-scented. When I mentioned that, I watched people's faces in the way I sometimes watch handwriting. Rupert looked away quickly. Leonard's hands tightened around his walking stick. Clara touched her forearm as if to reassure herself that she was present. Nora's face did not change at first. She moved in the house with a shopkeeper's economy of motion, and when she spoke she said simply that she used a strainer in her own preparations sometimes, and that her tin of concentrated bergamot would show wear if used. She offered to show the tin. There is a kind of reluctance in people when they are spoken to about their own small inventory. We keep certain things because to give them up is to show our own private capacity. Nora opened the cardboard box at her feet and, with the careful transparency of someone who has nothing to hide and yet does not expect full belief, produced a very small pot of oil-scented bergamot. The lid was smudged as if it had been handled in haste. I noticed, though, and said nothing, that the smudge matched the faint weathering on the tea strainer. Alibis took on the texture of the small, private ways we tell time. Nora said she had closed up the shop late the night before and had not returned to the house after leaving a small crate in the back room. Leonard insisted he had been smoking on the east path and returned directly to his room. Rupert maintained he had walked no farther than his lamp and his ledger. Peter's notes were precise about the attic entries, but less sure about the exact hour he'd gone to bed. Clara said she had sat awake for a long time thinking, and had heard a kettle, though she could not place whether it was the same kettle that served Mr. Fenton. I asked, gently and without presumption, who had made Mr. Fenton's tea. The answers were varied and small. "He makes his own tea, usually," someone offered. "I thought he had brewed it himself," another said. Each small deflection was a stone thrown into the margin of certainty. There was, beneath these small exchanges, a thread that kept pulling tighter, Mr. Fenton's notes and the letters he carried. Peter had catalogued a small number of envelopes and had found, among them, references to a few of the house's guests. They were not elaborate documents, more like sharp reminders. People who were threatened often call that threat by its proper name: payment. The presence of such a ledger in someone's pocket changes the way one reads their behavior. I found myself paying attention to the particulars that do not often make it into formal accounts, the way Rupert's ledger had a sum next to his name, the way Leonard's hands, when he held a cup, trembled more than they had the night before, how Clara's sketch, half hidden beneath a cushion, had a hurried line that might have been meant to erase a name. One might say these are circumstantial. They are. And yet circumstantial things, when consistent with one another, cohere into something that looks a lot like explanation. No answers were found in that day, only more questions, and a thin tension that moved through the house like a line of tide. People grew careful in their speech. They measured and measured again. The constable came and took formal notes, and the house continued, with a strange dignity to be a house. The people within it, though, were now bound to one another by the fact that something had occurred on their watch, and that each of them, in their own way, had been close to the chances that made possible what had happened. There is a quality to silence that is not simply the absence of sound, but the presence of small, held things. After the discovery, the house's silence changed shape. It was no longer merely restful. It became attentive, like a listener leaning forward to catch the final syllable of a sentence. People settled into routines that, in ordinary times, might have been unnoticed. Rupert checked the ledger as if its pages might rearrange themselves. Leonard's walk outside lengthened and then shortened. Someone would later remark how often he stood looking out to sea with his fists at his sides. Peter continued with his notebook, filling pages quietly, sometimes pausing to look in the corners as if the angles might offer him a new fact. Clara, who had a hand for shape, rearranged the cups on the shelf again and again, as if the act could restore order. Nora went about her tea-making with a steadiness that seemed both professional and necessary, her tins in order on the lower shelf like small, contented soldiers. I watched the ways people return to small acts of control because it is there, in those acts, that one often finds the truth of who they are. When there is a wrong that has been done, people reach for what they can hold. Some reach for facts. Some reach for ritual. That weekend, the house was a strange map of both. One detail you come to expect when you have paid attention to people for long enough is the trace object. It might be a matchbox, a button, a receipt. Such things in this house were particularly relevant because the thing that had taken Mr. Maff. Fenton from us all was subtle and discreet. It did not announce itself. It quietly removed the steady thrum of a life. I had, quietly, kept returning to the question of who had the means to make whatever had caused that quiet happen. Means often lies in the ordinary tools at hand, a cup, a strainer, a pot of tea. Mrs. Greaves' little pantry, the one behind the kitchen door with its shelf of tins and the single brass key to the china cupboard, was a place of permission. Not everyone had reason to open it. Nora had access, as did Mrs. Greaves, and possibly others who liked to keep their hands in domestic work. Peter had been in the attic, but his interest had been in paper rather than in tea tools. Leonard and Rupert could have used the kettle but did not usually concern themselves with the tins. As days passed, the house offered up accidents of evidence. When I rinsed a cup left in the sink, I noticed a faint ring of oil adhering to the lip. Oil is a particular thing. Bergamot, when concentrated, leaves a bright, citrusy residue. Nora's confession of keeping, in a small jar behind her counter, a concentrated bergamot for customers who wanted just a touch more, was no longer a charming aside. It became a note in the ledger of possibilities. The jar she had shown me earlier had the smudged lid that now seemed less casual than intended. There was also the matter of the receipt found in Mr. Fenton's jacket pocket. Peter had photographed it and placed it in his notebook, a small sheet with Nora's shop name and the date of a recent purchase. That was the sort of linkage that could mean many things: a morning buy of tea, a small transaction, a meeting arranged. It was concrete, and yet context matters. The receipt did not tell us what had been exchanged in words, only in coin. I noticed another small thing that sat with me: the way the sugar bowl had gone missing. It is a curious human tendency to remove the ordinary in moments of panic or haste. I thought of people moving a sugar bowl to a pantry in a hurry, of someone drying a spoon and tucking it away. Mrs. Greaves produced it later from the back of her cupboard, cleaned and set aside, as if she had found it where she always knew it might be. There was, however, a small tea strainer next to it that did not belong to the house set. It had a finer mesh than the common strainer and bore a faintly citrus-smelling oil in the grooves, a detail not conclusive on its own, but compelling in company with the other things that had shown up. There are also patterns in behavior. After the discovery, certain movements repeated, Nora smoothing the cloth on her workbench, Leonard going again and again to the same stretch of path, Rupert running his finger along the spine of a book and then withdrawing it, Peter making an entry and then crossing it out. One might read such repetitions as grief, but they were also gestures towards self-control in a situation that had eroded that control. Rumour is a soft thing that lives on edges. It moved in the house in small ways, a whispered suggestion that Mr. Nouse, in small ways, a whispered suggestion that Mr. Can. Fenton had been paid off once, a half-memory that someone at a dinner some years before had mentioned him, a suggestion that a name had been written down in a ledger with a figure beside it. Red herrings began to appear, as they always do when people search for cause and comfort. Clara's nervous erasures in her sketchbook suggested culpability to some, when in fact they were only the trace of an old argument with Mr. Fenton about the public mention of someone she had loved. The longer one listened, the more one realized how easily an ordinary fact could be turned into accusation. That is why an observer must keep an even gaze. I looked for consistency, for things that would be true whether examined by a friend or a stranger. The jar of bergamot, the receipt in the pocket, the absence and recovery of the sugar bowl, and the strainer with its peculiar film, these were the pieces I watched fit together. They did not yet form a finished picture, but they provided a scaffold. Evenings in the house became quiet review sessions, who had entered which room and when, whether a window had been opened, whether anyone had left the premises at night. People answered the questions the way they answer questions in their own heads, with small truths and the occasional omission. I do not make claims to being more than an observer. I asked questions because questions force doors to open in the way that subtlety does in small houses. The more doors opened, the clearer the pattern of movement became, and patterns are more persuasive than single facts. It occurred to me that what made the conclusion feel possible was not only the objects and receipts and stains, but the human texture of the acts themselves. The way the tins were handled, the way receipts are folded, the way someone might, in a moment of desperate resolution, use what is at hand and later attempt to make that usage look ordinary. The evidence was gentle. Human stories tend to be. Their force is in their accumulation, not in any one dramatic flash. The house, by the time the second evening fell, had learned to move with a soft economy. People took up activities that made the day resemble the last. Rupert continued his ledger, cataloguing the house as if listing might restore a sense of propriety. Peter's notebook thickened with entries and an increasing number of question marks. Leonard's walks, once a taciturn ritual, became short and sharp, as if he were testing his footing on familiar ground. I found myself returning, repeatedly, to the small details that had suggested a connection between Mr. Fenton and the tea that had been in his room. The strainer with the citrus film had been placed carefully back into the pantry by someone who seemed to think they had not been noticed. Yet some things do not disappear so easily. A faint smear of oil on the lip of the teacup, a scrap of receipt in a pocket, a scrap of a particular thread of wool caught on a chair leg. These are the sorts of things that reappear in the work of observation. There is a particular human shape to the lie of intent. We see it in hurried gestures, in the way a man says he went straight to bed when he did not, in the way a woman folds her hands a moment longer than is comfortable when a certain name is said. Those are not decisive proofs. They are, however, places where motive reveals itself as something slightly bent and human. The house became a map of those bends. I spoke privately with Nora that evening. She was arranging tins on a lower shelf, and her hands had the business-like steadiness of someone who measures life in teaspoons. When I asked her about the receipt, she said simply that Mr. Fenton had come into her shop the week before and bought a small tin of bergamot as a favor for a guest. She said the purchase had seemed like a little kindness. On her face was a weariness that did not belong to a woman who would boast of any wrongdoing. One must be careful with tenderness in observation, because it can slide into sentiment that obscures facts. I asked then about the small pot of concentrated bergamot she had described earlier, the thing she had shown in the parlour. Nora answered quietly that she kept it for customers who asked for an extra note, that it had a pungent oiliness and should be used sparingly. That she had the means to make a cup more strongly scented was not remarkable. It was not unusual in a small seaside shop. There was, however, another point to note. Someone, it seemed, had adjusted the curtains in Mr. Fenton's room that night. The latch showed fresh marks and a faint smudge of something on the sill that matched the oil on the strainer. The pattern of footprints outside the window indicated someone had walked the path that passed by the hedge after midnight. Leonard's walking stick, when I examined it quietly, bore the faint pattern of sea-dried mud that matched one of the tracks. That did not make Leonard guilty of anything, only present in the right place at the right time. What complicates things is the way motive and opportunity drift around one another without ever quite meeting in the bright light of certainty. Motive in this house was easy to find. People had things to lose, small reputations, and the intangible assets of privacy and a future that would remain undisturbed if certain papers did not come to light. Mr. Fenton had been present as a small, constant pressure on those possibilities. Then there was the ledger in Mr. Fenton's jacket, the small list of names beside small sums that Peter had photographed. Rupert's name was there with an amount that could be construed in many ways. Clara's name appeared as well, but beside hers was only a note that suggested a conversation rather than anything financial. Leonard's was written differently, in a scratchy hand that suggested a different kind of arrangement. The ledger was not a smoking gun. It was merely a record of negotiations, the way people sometimes keep the memory of payments even when the moral ledger is much more mixed. When I went back to the tray in Mr. Fenton's room a second time, I noticed a delicate thing under the cup, an irregularity in the glaze where a small deposit had been left with the last wash. It looked like an oil ring, not entirely dissolved by water. It reminded me of the pot Nora had shown me, and of her words that a little goes a long way. That language, I thought, was not careless. Traders who know their own words speak in precise warnings. Nora had done so publicly. I pressed no accusations. Instead, I asked questions in a way that is less likely to provoke and more likely to reveal. I asked Rupert to show me where he had been that night. He drew a small map in the margin of his ledger, his room, the parlour, the path to the kitchen. He marked where the lamp had been left on and where the kettle sits. Leonard, though brusque, told me about his walk and showed me the worn spot on his stick where the salt had gathered. Clara admitted, with a look, that she had been awake and that she had heard voices at one point, and that she had been unnerved by the way Mr. Fenton had smiled at her the night before. It is their small admissions that often do the most work in a quiet investigation. They do not, on their own, prove much, but combined they begin to create a plausible account. Someone had visited Mr. Fenton late. They had used something to change his cup. The means to do so, a concentrated oil, a strainer, a moment of trust, were available. The motive, a ledger of payments, threats implied by letters, the possibility of lives being upturned, was present and pressing. Opportunity, motive, means, these are the old coordinates of a mystery, and they made a tidy map in that little house. A shadow shifted in the parlor that night when I brought these small facts together aloud. Faces tightened for a variety of reasons: fear, shame, and that old protective pride we all carry. Nora stood still and asked if she should call someone. Leonard watched the curtains as if expecting a storm. Rupert folded his hands in the manner of a man counting what he would lose. Clara looked away as if a certain memory had become too bright to hold. It is in those shifting shadows that revelations begin to form, not as in the sudden thunderclap of theatrical confession, but as a quiet accumulation of things that point, gently but persistently, toward a human explanation. I asked more questions and watched people answer them with the small evasive care of those who do not yet know where they stand in the unfolding story. The house listened, and in listening it taught us its next small truth, that people will protect those they love in ways that later seem inevitable, and that sometimes the protective act is itself the wrong one. That afternoon, a missing piece of the puzzle presented itself in the most ordinary of ways, a scrap found tucked inside the lining of a coat pocket. Peter had been cataloguing the clothes with a care reserved for fragile paper when he came upon it. A small creased receipt that matched the stationery of Nora's shop and bore, in a hand I recognized as Mr. Fenton's quick script, a note of an appointment. It read only, Saturday morning, 9:30 D.B. Such things are not decisive, but they are particular. A receipt is the mark of an ordinary transaction. The appointment note next to it suggests an intention to meet. I thought then of the admission Nora had made that Mr. Nora had made. That Mr. Nora. Fenton had come into her shop and bought a tin of bergamot not long before the weekend. It is a small human thing to arrange a meeting over tea when there are matters to be settled. It is another thing entirely if one of those matters involves pressure, blackmail, or disgrace. I walked the house with the receipt folded in my palm as if it was something warm. I noticed, as I always do, how things map people. There is a particular trace that indicates repeated use. The way the inside of a pocket is worn at one corner, the way a tin's lid bears a small crescent of rubber residue where a hand has rested on it for years. The lid of Nora's tiny pot was smudged. The strainer that had been returned to the pantry bore an oil ring that matched the faint film on a teacup. These were consistencies, not proofs. The more I thought about it, the more plausible a sequence became, Mr. called. Fenton met with someone, a cup of tea was poured, something changed in that cup. He drank and later was found quiet. To many minds that is an ugly leap. To an observer it is simply a hypothesis that deserves the dignity of tests and questions. I was not, at that stage, interested in accusing. I wanted to fill in the timeline and see which links held steady. I asked to speak privately with Nora. She sat at the small work table in the corner of the kitchen and arranged tins with the intense concentration of someone doing delicate embroidery. When I mentioned the receipt and the appointment, her hands paused but did not shake. He came into my shop, she said, paid in cash. He said it was to settle something and that he would call in the morning. Her voice was the tone of someone telling a fact about the weather, a thing that was true without being dramatic. I asked her about the pot of concentrated bergamot. She answered plainly that she kept it for special requests and that she had used it that week on a customer's tea who had wanted it stronger. Then, with an honesty that was small and careful, she said Mr. Fenton had been paying attention to what she sold. He had remarked on the tin and had asked if she could make his tea stronger for a certain guest. She had given him a small amount in a sealed packet, she said, thinking nothing of it, a matter of hospitality, a small trade between shopkeeper and customer. Her manner was not defensive. It was more the way someone lists details after an event, a woman who has washed her hands of something and is trying to account for them precisely. Yet there was one additional detail she offered under the breath. Mr. Bai. Fenton had been persistent about a young man in the village, Nora's son, and had hinted that there were things that might be made public. That was the sort of essential human pressure that can become the pivot of a desperate act. When I put the sequence aloud to her, the meeting, the cup, the presence of the bergamot, Nora did not deny it. She said that she had seen him as a man who had found a new way to make a living, and that she had not thought he would go as far as he seemed to suggest. She had agreed to meet, and perhaps she had thought that her shop could supply small comfort. She shook her head, and when she spoke of her son, her voice broke the way. We break when we do not wish to call attention to a wound. There is a human economy in which we weigh the cost of exposure against the cost of action. For some, it is the loss of reputation. For others, the loss of a livelihood, or, far worse, the safety of a child. When a person stands at that crossroads, their choice is rarely the work of cold logic. It is the work of hot, immediate feeling. What I heard from Nora was not a villain's plan, narrated with cold, professional calm. It was a mother's fear speaking in small, definite terms. I continued to look for physical consistencies. Near the hedge where the path curves, I found a small thread of wool hooked on a twig, a blue thread that matched the edge of Nora's cardigan, which she had borrowed from the shop for warmth. It is a small, almost trivial thing. Textile traces are easy to dismiss. Yet when one places textile residue alongside a receipt, and a smudged jar lid, and an oil ring on a cup, the cumulative weight of these small facts begins to argue for a plausible chain. Still, there were other, gentler misdirections. Clara's crossed line in her sketchbook was not, as some had suspected, evidence of her intention, but an attempt to blot out a cruel remark Mr. Fenton had made about someone she cared for many years ago. Rupert's ledger, though it held an amount beside his name, also contained an entry noting that the sum had been repaid months ago, which complicated the straightforward notion of extortion. Leonard's tracks were everywhere because he walked at night to clear his head. His presence in the garden was not proof, only confirmation of opportunity. I placed these things together the way one places a collection of stones on a table: the receipt, the jar lid, the oil smear, the thread. They did not compel a single verdict, but they made one account feel more likely than another. If someone had meant to silence Mr. Fenton, they had used what was at hand, an ordinary supply, a cup, a strainer, and they had done it in a house where many people had the means to be both helpful and dangerous. That night, as people made their preparations for the evening, I noticed the parlor lamp throwing a softer light than usual. Someone had moved the armchair Mr. Fenton favored. Someone had placed his jacket on a peg, though it had not been his usual habit to leave it there. Little gestures like that are not decisive either, but I make note of them because human beings are repository animals. We leave fragments of ourselves in the places we pass. If there was guilt to be felt, it would be in those fragments. If there was confession to be made, it would likely come in the form of a small admission rather than a dramatic denouement. I did not want to ask a question that would needlessly wound, but I also felt the pull of the evidence formed by such commonplace things. The missing piece had arrived in a receipt. The path from receipt to meeting to cup felt plausible. People in this house were, as people are, capable of both great restraint and sudden brashness. The fact suggested a plausible actor, but I waited, as I usually do, for human speech to complete the outline. When words come, they make the quiet parts of a case intelligible. For now, the house would have to hold its breath a while longer and let speech, if it came, arrive in its own time. Conversations in these moments tend to arrive in small private pieces. I had learned by then that the loud, dramatic confession was a rarity. Most truths arrive as if by chance, in the way a tide brings a shell to shore. Nora found me in the parlour with a steady, quiet look on her face. She had the air of someone who had finished a long day and was ready at last to say the thing that must be said. We stood by the lamp where the light was steady, and neither of us made any performance of courage. There is a particular softness to confessions that are not seeking absolution but only clarity. "He threatened my boy," she said simply. The words were like a small stone dropped into the basin of a wide bowl and watched as the ripples spread. She spoke in a voice that had been honed by business and by worry. "He said he would speak to the paper, that he had letters confirming something that would make life hard for my Tom." I asked what she had done. She paused in a way that suggested she had formed and reformed the sentence a dozen times. When she finally spoke, she did so with the kind of plainness that leaves no room for flourish. "I meant to frighten him," she said. "I thought if I could make him ill, not to kill him, but to scare him into stopping. I brought a small thing from the shop that I knew would make a cup stronger than he expected. I did not mean to end his life." She said it without rhetorical flourish. The confession was a factual account, not an apology rehearsed for an audience. There are moments when intent and outcome diverge with cruel abruptness. People do terrible things convinced that the balance will hold in their favor, and then discover that the world is less accommodating than the calculation. Nora's account, as she told it, was not meant to be an elaborate story. It was the admission of a human being describing an action born of fear. I listened without attempting to transform her words into anything theatrical. She had been in the parlour with Mr. Ajolles. Fenton the night before, she said. She had brought with her a small sealed packet that he had admired in the shop. He had asked, bluntly, what she could do for him, and she had offered him something that, for her, would have been an unkindness, but not a finality. When he had not agreed to her terms, when he had continued to press and insinuate, she said she had returned to his room, poured what she had in his cup and left before she thought to look for a sign that he had swallowed everything without complaint. She told the story in a manner that did not seek to minimize the act, but rather to explain the motive. The moral arithmetic of such choices is a private thing, and I heard the calculus in the plain way she described it, the balance between a son's future and a risque act of theft from trust. Her face was quiet as she spoke of the moment. There was sorrow in her voice that seemed to have nothing to do with fear of consequence, and everything to do with the realization that she had inflicted a harm she could not undo. When she finished, there was a long moment of silence. The house seemed to exhale. The facts she had provided aligned with the pattern we had observed, the receipt, the laboured pot, the jar lid smudged in haste, the thread on the hedge. All of these things were now cast in a human account rather than only in the cold geometry of evidence. Nora did not make excuses. She said that fear had driven her and that she had thought the brief alarm of an upset stomach or a strange night might be enough to make Mr. Fenton stop. She admitted she had not stayed to see what would happen. She had left and hoped he would be frightened into silence. The admission that she had intended to silence him, even if not to kill him, changed the quality of what had been done. People who choose to interfere in such ways do so because they think they have no other recourse. It is a lonely and terrible place to be. We spoke of responsibility in the small, clear manner of people whose options are fading. I asked about her son. She told me he had been in a scrape years before, a young mistake that had left the family vulnerable to the kind of malicious attention a man like Mr. Fenton might enjoy. She said very plainly that she had felt the net closing and that she had acted in a single motion of desperation. That evening, of course, other conversations took place. I did not want to be the instrument of a theatrical moment. Confessions so often feel like performances when given to an audience. Nora's confession was private and accidental in its privacy. She had come to me not to make a spectacle, but to be heard by someone who listens. One might wonder, if one wished to be harsh, why she had acted so precipitously instead of seeking the constable or the protection that might have been available. Such questions are not judgments I make lightly. Rather, they are the ones most people will ask themselves later in the sterile light of retrospect. Mrs. Greaves, upon hearing the admission in the quiet room where we stood, moved with the economy of someone who knows the next steps. She called the constable. The house entered later that night the more formal patience of law and procedure. The manner of the handover was gentle. No one sought scandal as sport. I watched as Nora, small and resolute, sat in the kitchen and folded her hands into the cloth and allowed the next part of the story, which was not mine to tell, to begin. The neat thing about a quiet confession is how it reorders the evidence into a pattern that seems inevitable afterwards. The receipt that once was merely a paper becomes a hinge, the smudged lid becomes a key, the thread on the hedge maps to a coat and to a hand. All of this is, in the end, human. We take the things available to us when we are afraid, and we act in ways that we believe will protect. Sometimes those acts protect, and sometimes they destroy. I do not envy Nora her reckoning. She was not the image of a cold, calculating villain. She was a woman who had pressed her palm to a danger and misread the strength of the current. There is nothing neat in that truth. There is only the complication of sorrow and consequence. The house held us all then, in the long aftermath, and the sea outside kept moving as if nothing had changed at all. Inside, everything had shifted. The days that followed the confession were not the sort of days that resolve quickly. The village constable came and did what a constable must. The facts were recorded, and the house, bound by law and by its own sense of decency, moved through the next steps with discreet care. Nora, without dramatics, surrendered what she had told me to the proper authorities. She did this with a sort of quiet dignity that made the house feel both smaller and more public at once. In the parlour, people returned to the ordinary tasks that had not ceased to exist. Rupert continued to catalogue. Clara handled the teacups as if they might speak if treated kindly enough. Leonard walked the path and watched the sea with the same steadfast gaze. And Peter filled his notebook with an astonishing steadiness. The things that had most concerned us, the receipt, the jar lid, the strainer, the thread, fit one another in a way that left fewer loose edges. Once assembled into a narrative, one sees how an accumulation of small choices moved the house toward a grief none of us had expected. There are parts of such revelations that are public and parts that are private. The public parts are the facts: a meeting, a receipt, a pot of concentrated bergamot, a cup, a man found still. The private parts are harder to account for: the shaking hands, the quiet ways a woman measures her son's safety against the exposure of shame, the small thought that one can control a situation with a small, decisive act. In talking to the others, what struck me most was not the obviousness of the motive, but the humanity of it. People made their choices in small, ordinary currencies: promises to children, a wish to keep an old friendship unbroken, a concern for a reputation earned by years of steady work. Mr. Meyer. Fenton had been, by many accounts, a man who had discovered a way to profit from the vulnerabilities of others. That cruelty masks itself easily beneath the velvet of civility, and the house, which had known gentler occupants, had been ill prepared for that kind of extractive attention. I took another walk through the garden at dusk. The path still bore faintly the marks we had all learned to read, the boot prints that were Leonard's, the faint thread that had caught on a twig, the smudge on the sill where a hand had rested. I found myself smoothing a chair cushion until the shape felt right under my hands. The act was less about restoration and more about bridging a small distance between motive and consequence. Mrs. Greaves sat by the fire that evening and set a cup of tea on the side table, but she did not drink from it. She had watched the house close in on itself, watched the guests become something like a small, accidental family bound for sorrow. She spoke to me in a voice that was, as ever, practical and lacking in spectacle. "These walls have heard so many things," she said. "They keep them, as if saving all the small troubles for some later time when they might be more easily explained." I told her I would stay as long as she wished. There was a sort of routine I followed in these matters. Notice, ask, and then, when the truth is revealed, sit with the people who must live with the fall of that truth. It is not my place to pass sentence or to claim any higher wisdom. I only observe, and what I observed then was an ordinary fact. Flawed people make flawed choices. Some of those choices lead, by accident or by design, to terrible outcomes. After Nora's confession, some questions naturally receded, and others became sharper. How might we have intervened earlier? Could Mr. Fenton have been restrained by a social mechanism rather than by desperation? Those are the questions television loves because they are neat. In life, they are ragged and full of incomplete answers. The house, in the end, did what houses do. It became a place of memory and then of departure. On the last morning I noticed small gestures of care that seemed to be about more than the objects. Mrs. Greaves wrapped the willow tray carefully, not for sale, but perhaps for remembrance. Clara smoothed the edge of a teacup with a tenderness that felt like apology. Leonard stood at the window and watched the tide, hands in the pockets of his coat. I found, sitting among the items, the small ledger Mr. Fenton had kept. It was, in the end, a record of leverage, names, amounts, and the shorthand of people who think that fear can be made to do work for them. That was the closest thing to motive one needed. He had made a business of private facts, and he had run across people who found that business intolerable when it targeted those they loved. There are no neat villains in stories like these. Nora acted badly, yes, and she admitted it. But there was a human impulse behind her action, a wish to protect the child from ruin. The moral calculus she performed was, from one point of view, a failure, from another, an understandable disaster. It is the job of justice to attend to such things with rules and clarity. It is the job of small communities to sit with the sorrow that remains after procedure does its work. When the day came to pack the last of the things, the house felt as though it were releasing a long-held breath. The chairs were wrapped and stacked, the tins labelled and boxed, the ledger's pages tucked into an envelope. People moved with the tender custody of those who have seen how small acts can unmake a life, and wanted, perhaps, to mend the smallest of them. I took one final cup of tea in the empty parlour, allowing the quiet to settle in my bones. It occurred to me then, not with any great insight, but with the peaceful acceptation of an observer, that truth in small houses always arrives in fragments. It takes time for the pieces to be placed so that they make sense. When they do, what remains is the human work of reckoning, apology, consequence, and the slow stitching back together of what has been frayed. The last afternoon was like the slow closing of a well-read book. The sky had that washed pallor of late autumn, and the sea moved in its dependable, indifferent way. Mrs. Greaves moved from room to room, making small, decisive choices about what to keep and what to let go. The house was a little emptier with each box placed on the cart. I watched as villagers and a van from the local archives took away the things that would be preserved: a brass lamp, the ledger, a set of photographed letters. Others were carried off by relatives or neighbours who had come to claim a fragment of memory, and the house breathed out a sound that was somewhere between relief and mourning. There were few speeches. Mrs. Greaves offered a short, plain thank you to those who had been present over the weekend. Nora was quiet, the lines about her eyes settled like small chords. She accepted what must come with a steadiness that was not bravado so much as a kind of resigned courage. The constable had completed his work in the manner of duty done, and left us to the ways of private grief. People wrap themselves in the kinds of small gestures that make endings bearable. A cup folded into paper, a photograph slid into a sleeve, a handful of sand from the sill tucked into a pocket as if the place itself might be carried. Leonard stood a little apart at the low wall, watching the sea. Rupert, who had counted money with more nervous energy than seemed necessary over the last days, handed an item quietly back to Mrs. Greaves. "For old times," he said. I sat at the parlour window and watched the light move across the room. There is a particular chiaroscuro to rooms that have been lived in. The shadows keep accounts. The house had its ledger closed now in one sense, but the weight of the weekend would remain in the small private ways people would move through their days for months, perhaps years. When things were almost done, Mrs. Greaves and I stood on the threshold. She held the key to the front door in her palm and turned it over slowly, the metal ringing softly. She did not speak of regret in the dramatic way people expect in novels. She spoke of practical things, what to do with the last bills, where to send the notice about the post. There is a dignity in that, a refusal to let melodrama claim more than ordinary sorrow. I do not mean to make a sermon of it. People did wrong in the house, and they were held to account in the way small communities do. Nora's action had been a terrible miscalculation born of maternal fear. She had been unwise and then brave in admitting what she had done. The law will determine the necessary steps from here. My part, such as it is, was to witness and to look for the small consistencies that one day permit explanation. There was one brief, private moment I allowed myself before I left. I picked up one of the chipped teacups and held it in my hand, feeling the weight of the glaze and the faint grit of salt on its rim. It struck me as a small emblem of the weekend, ordinary objects that mean more because they carry the traces of human lives. I returned it to the shelf where it had lived for so long, and in doing so closed another small chapter of the house's story. The road back up from the house felt oddly like a slow shed of weight. The town behind me resumed its day, shops swinging open, a child running with a kite, the usual untroubled motions that life requires. I did not feel triumphant. I felt rather that gentle fatigue that follows a long evening of attention. There are a few things I still recall with the clarity that sometimes comes to those who have watched the matter to its quiet end. Mr. Fenton had been a man who used private facts as currency. Nora had been a woman who loved a son enough to risk a wrong. The house had been the place where those things met. The consequence was as human as any consequence of our petty, tender failings, sorrow, a confession, and the steady arrival of justice in its own measured steps. I left the lane with the sound of the sea in my ears, and the image of the house's bay windows glowing faintly in the dusk. Lighthouses guide ships by their steady refusal to move. There is an odd consolation in the house's stillness now, not because it had been made whole, but because, like many quiet things, it would hold the scar of what occurred and then continue to do the small work of being itself. If you have been following the details closely, you might have seen how one small object, a receipt, a tin, a smear on a cup, can become more than itself when combined with human fear and desperate intention. That is the quiet moral of this case, that we are effective at hurting what we love when fear narrows our vision. We are also, interestingly, capable of telling the truth when the pressure becomes unbearable. The house closed its shutters under a sky that was neither bright nor stormy, and I walked down the lane with the soft, steady pace of someone who has listened and taken note. There are more stories to find in other houses and other rooms, and I will be going on in the small, particular habit of noticing. For tonight, the boarding house on the cliff will sleep with its last things boxed and its echoes folded in like linen. The sea will keep doing what it always does. The people will find, slowly, ways to live with what they have done and what has been done to them. It occurred to me, one last time as I reached the road, that endings are not always resolutions. Often, they are merely changes of shape. The quiet that settled over the place felt like that kind of change, not complete repair, but a return to a different, steadier stillness,